Let's get right to it because it was a really busy week in politics for Alberta and elsewhere, actually. It started with a showdown between interim Progressive Conservative leader Rick McIver and Speaker of the Assembly Bob Wanner over a private member's motion, not the thing you think is going to create a ruckus in the legislature. Then, a spike in sick leave and long-term disability among Alberta Health Services employees over the past several years has the health minister under fire. But first up, Greg Sellinger's NDP government in Manitoba was dealt a devastating blow in that province's election this week, whittling the party's former majority status down to a mere 14 seats as the Progressive Conservatives swept to power with an astonishing 40 out of 57 seats in the legislature. Now, that leaves Premier Rachel Notley as the country's last NDP premier standing. What does that mean for Alberta's NDP government? Graham, I want to start with you. You asked Notley about this very thing in an interview this week. What did she say? How did she play it?
Well, she was joking. She said, I'm not the last of a line. I'm the beginning of a new wave of NDP premiers coming in. Well, yeah, good luck with that. But I think that I should have to joke about it. Otherwise, if you don't laugh, you kind of cry over it, from her point of view. It is interesting, though, for her, all of a sudden, because she is the only NDP premier, gives her a lot more clout within the party at the federal level in terms of leadership. Who's going to be, she could help get a leader chosen at the federal level, one more to her liking. And also, it may mean that she has more clout when it comes to things like the LEAP manifesto and defeating that as well. The one we talked about last time.
Oh, how could we forget?
Yes, exactly. So I think that even though it's bad news for the NDP overall, it may be good news in some ways for Rachel Notley.
Yeah. I think that Canada has a long history of having a balance of powers. I mean, and traditionally, when federal politics moves to the left, provincial politics often moves to the right, sort of as a counterweight. So you could argue that that's what's happening here, that Trudeau's very crushing victory in the federal election, which everybody said at the time was the death of Canadian conservatism, right? So federally, their chances are squished at the moment, and so I think some of that energy is going back into provincial elections. But I think sometimes things just happen, and it's a question of personalities as much as anything else and local conditions. Brad Wall is very personally popular in Saskatchewan, and I think there was a lot of feeling that Greg Sellinger had worn out his welcome in Manitoba, that it was less about a rejection of, that it was less about an embrace of conservatism than it was about the fact that the Sellinger government was just stale and tired, and people were fed up with it.
The opposition, though, in Alberta here want to paint this as, well, voters elsewhere are seeing what the Alberta NDP are doing, and they're seeing the damage that they're doing. And this represents, a repudiation of NDP governments across the country. I don't know if I buy that voters in other provinces are actually paying that much attention to what's happening here. I don't know that voters pay much attention to what's happening in their own province to begin with. But Keith, do you buy that, or is that politicking on the opposition's part?
No, I mean, you heard the laughter in here. It is a little laughable. I mean, when I go to cast a ballot, I don't think, oh God, look at what's going on in Quebec or Ontario or New Brunswick. That's going to affect who I vote for in Alberta in a provincial election. No, I don't think people do that. I think Paul is right that the result in Manitoba had more to do with the failures of that Greg Sellinger government. In Saskatchewan, Brad Wall's a very popular leader and has been, and maybe people there are have memories of their own NDP government back in the 90s, which was a disaster in the end in some ways, where the government went broke and they had to cut all kinds of services, close rural hospitals and so on. So I suspect that's more on their minds than anything going on in Alberta.
Yeah,
right
also
now.
just quickly with Sellinger, he promised he wouldn't be raising the sales tax, and he did.
Yeah.
And there's a lesson there, I think, for the NDP here, and they know that they can't make a promise regarding taxation and then break the promise during a mandate, which is why they're kind of being really vague here. What happens after this mandate's over? Will there be a sales tax in Alberta if they're still the government in the years to come? And they're not saying no.